Okay, so I'm going to attempt to teach you about depolarization and repolarization of a neuron. So this model has a phospholipid bilayer. All right, so this is one side of the neuron, and this is the other side of the neuron over here. And then embedded in the phospholipid bilayer are different kinds of channels, protein channels. This is a gated sodium channel, so it opens and can close, and it allows sodium ions to be transported, but only when they're open. So the sodium is going to be the blue circles. This is a potassium leak channel that allows potassium to leak out, and you notice it's not gated. And then this is a gated potassium channel. Notice that these are opened. This allows sodium to enter, and then this allows potassium to leave. And then this is a sodium-potassium pump, which can be used to create an imbalance of sodium and potassium. And here's ATP that's going to power the pump. Also notice inside the neuron are proteins which have negative charges. So there are anions. So both potassium, which is the purple squares, and sodium are positively charged ions, so they're cations. Okay, so nerve cells, just as they are overall positive on the outside and negative on the inside. And that's primarily because they have more sodium on the outside than they do potassium on the inside. And one of the reasons for that is that notice there's a potassium leak channel, but there's very few sodium leak channels. So the sodium-potassium pump is what creates more sodium outside than potassium inside. But because there's a higher concentration of potassium inside than outside, some more of that potassium leaks out. So that just makes it more positive on the outside than on the inside, because there's fewer places for the sodium to leak in. Also, you've got these negatively charged proteins on the inside, making this more negative relative to the outside. So this difference in charge between the outside and the inside is called a voltage. So any difference in charge gives you a voltage, which gives you potential energy. So that's one of the things that's really important on how nerves fire. So you have this more positive on the outside than on the inside, and that gives you a negative membrane potential. So the potential is the difference in charge between the outside and the inside. So one of the things I'm going to show you is the sodium-potassium pump and how that works. So here's the sodium-potassium pump. Notice that there are little spots for the sodium to enter, and there's little spots for the potassium to enter. And so when it's facing inside, any sodium that might be inside, remember there's not a lot of sodium on the inside, but there might be some sodium on the inside, they're going to load up here in these little spots. And then ATP, I remember you guys learned this before when you were learning about membrane proteins and transport. But here's ATP, here's that last phosphate. That binds here. Like, remember, this is the fork in the butt thing. When it binds there, it causes the sodium-potassium pump to change shape. It dumps the sodium out. Then the potassium that might be on the outside can come into these binding sites. The phosphate, it dephosphorylates, and then this will flip back to its original shape and allow the potassium to come in. So that's what's creating this gradient all the time. This is working and requiring ATP. So there's a molecule of ATP needed every single time that thing flips in and out. Okay, so when a nerve fires, what happens is that these sodium channels that are gated, they're called voltage-gated sodium channels. When the nerve fires, these will open, and that will cause sodium to move in by diffusion. And that will cause the neuron that was once positive on the outside and negative on the inside to become positive on the inside relative to the outside. So right here, the membrane potential is going to switch. So we call that depolarized. And then once these open and let the sodium in, they'll close. And then that will cause the next sodium channels that are downstream of that to open, and then the sodium will rush in there. And so you have this sort of wave of depolarization that moves along the neuron, which is really what's called the action potential, which is how the nerve fires. But behind that, so after these open, right, and cause the next sodium channels to open, etc., behind that are these potassium channels. And so when the nerve depolarizes, they open. They're gated, right? They're not always open. And that allows potassium to leak out, to be let out. And that repolarizes the charge. So now, again, it's going to be positive on the outside relatively to the inside because of all this potassium that's leaked out. So you have depolarization, then you have repolarization, and then you need to reset it up again. So you're going to have your sodium-potassium pump get all the sodium back out and all the potassium back in. And then the nerve will be back to resting again. So I'm going to show you this with some animations as well, but that's the basic plan. Sodium channels open, that depolarizes the neuron. The subsequent sodium channels will open, and that will go along the whole length of the neuron. And then behind that, the potassium channels will open, and that repolarizes the neuron. And then you go back to your sodium-potassium pump to get back to the resting state. Okay, so that concludes this video. The next video I'm going to teach you about what happens at the end of the neuron, which is the synapse.